Hello there, good evening. Game over, the message from Donald Trump to his critics today, as a long-awaited report found his presidential campaign did not collude with Russia over his 2016 bid for the White House. The president believes it means complete exoneration, but the 448-page report does reveal that the US leader tried to get the man in charge of the investigation, Special Counsel Robert Mueller, sacked and obstructed the inquiry at least 10 times. Well, it found that President Trump engaged in efforts to curtail the special counsel's investigation and prevent the disclosure of evidence to it. After learning about the appointment of the special counsel in May 2017, President Trump allegedly slumped back in his chair and said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency." Despite those fears, Mueller reports that the evidence his team obtained did not establish that the president was involved in an underlying crime related to Russian election interference. And the special counsel concluded that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him.
President Trump faced an unprecedented situation. As he entered into office and sought to perform his responsibilities as president, federal agents and prosecutors were scrutinizing his conduct before and after taking office and the conduct of some of his associates. At the same time, there was relentless speculation in the news media about the president's personal culpability. Yet, as he said from the beginning, there was, in fact, no collusion.
Well, our US correspondent Amanda Walker is in Washington. It's very long. People are still mulling this report. But where does it leave the president? And indeed, where does it leave Congress and its response to this?
Well, it depends who you listen to on this. And certainly if you take the Democratic point of view on this, they are saying that this is a far cry from exoneration when you have details, facts, as Mueller puts in his investigation, that, for example, Donald Trump tried to have Robert Mueller fired, that he insisted or asked for loyalty from the former FBI director. A whole host of things, which is important to be said, that at the time were called fake news by the administration, that are now stated as fact in Robert Mueller's investigation. It doesn't scream exoneration. Obstruction of justice is really the big thing, where the door was left open on that by the summary given in William Barr's initial letter that was a month ago, and also by Robert Mueller himself, who seems to say, look, some of the things that Donald Trump did were highly questionable, although he did have the authority as president to do some of them, and that traditionally obstruction of justice is about covering up a crime. And in terms of conspiracy with Trump's campaign and the Russians, he clearly states that there was no crime. Of course, if you speak to the Trump administration, they say this is a cause for celebration. This is underscoring what the summary did, complete exoneration. Here's Donald Trump from earlier.
I'm having a good day, too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction. There never was, by the way, and there never will be. And we do have to get to the bottom of these things, I will say. And this should never happen to another president again. This hoax, this should never happen to another president again.
So he calls it presidential harassment in a tweet today. Also, he used the Game of Thrones imagery again, saying game over. Game of Thrones producers have actually said, please stop doing that. He's done it before. We don't want that image and those images to be used for political purposes. But clearly, Donald Trump is doing what he does, trying to guide the narrative of this, which is why I think we saw the Attorney General come out and give that news conference before anyone had had the chance to read a word of this report. There was a definite effort to get out ahead of it, to say what people should be thinking about it, because of course they know, even if there is no actual criminal activity here, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that can be deemed as being very wrong. And we are heading into an election. 2020 is on the horizon, which is why the Democrats will ensure that this doesn't end here. They've already said they want to see Robert Mueller testify. They think what the report says really undercuts the summary, which which concluded that there was no obstruction of justice. They're saying that they want to hear from Robert Mueller. Here's Gerald Nadler, who is the chair of the And we're live actually now to Adam Schiff, another leading Democrat. Let's hear what he's got to say, presumably having read some of the report.
First, as we reported some time ago and as the intelligence community disclosed as well, there was an extensive campaign by the Russians to interfere in our elections in 2016. That interference took many forms, but most significantly, it took the form of an effort through social media to divide the country, to push out favored narratives, to assist the Trump campaign on social media through a massive effort led by the Internet Research Agency out of St. Petersburg. It also embarked on an effort to hack and dump emails from the Democratic campaign of Hillary Clinton, from her campaign manager John Podesta, and other efforts through their hacking and dumping operation to influence the outcome in the election. These efforts, similar to the social media campaign, were designed to help one party, Donald Trump, and hurt another, Hillary Clinton. There were also efforts through any number of meetings between Russians and Trump campaign people to exert influence, a covert influence operation mounted by the Russians that continued during the campaign as well as after the campaign. And I want to make several points about these findings for what we can tell so far from the Mueller report. First, the Attorney General did a grave disservice to the country by misrepresenting significant parts of the Mueller report, by attempting to put a positive spin for the president on the special counsel's findings. The Attorney General is not the president's personal lawyer, although he may feel he is. He is supposed to be the highest law enforcement officer in the land, and he is supposed to represent the interests of the American people. But when the Attorney General gives the perception that the president fully cooperated in the investigation when he didn't, that they provided all the information materials when they didn't, when the president, in fact, deprived the special counsel of perhaps the single most important piece of evidence, that is his own verbal testimony, that misleads the American people. When the Attorney General represents on the obstruction case or suggests that the special counsel desired him to make that decision, that the special counsel wasn't mindful of the Office of Legal Counsel opinion that a special counsel cannot indict a sitting president, when the Attorney General mischaracterizes the report in that way, he does a disservice to the country. A few things leap out about the substantive allegations on obstruction of justice and the issue of conspiracy. On the issue of obstruction of justice, the report outlines multiple attempts by the president to mislead the country, to interfere with the investigation, to make false statements to the American people, and to urge others to lie to the American people, to urge those of his staff to take actions to further obstruct the investigation, which may have been refused, but they were not refused owing to any goodwill or good motive on the president's part, far to the contrary. That these actions had a material impact on the investigation, that in fact the special counsel was deprived of information, or at least the timely access to that information as a result of things that the president did and said. It made our job, certainly in our committee during our investigation, that much more difficult, as it did the special counsel's investigation. Those acts of obstruction of justice, whether they are criminal or not, are deeply alarming in the President of the United States. And it's clear that Special Counsel Mueller wanted the Congress to consider the repercussions and the consequences. It is clear the Special Counsel believed that no one was above the law, and that includes the President of the United States. The Attorney General's actions would make the President above the law, would make the President such that he cannot commit the crime of obstruction of justice. That was not the Special Counsel's view. If the Special Counsel, as he made clear, had found evidence exonerating the President, he would have said so. He did not. He left that issue to the Congress of the United States, and we will need to consider it. On the issue of conspiracy, and again, in contrast to what the Attorney General represented, as I have said all along, each of the acts that I enumerated, each of the meetings, each of the contacts is not only spelled out in this report, corroborated in this report, but additional contacts and acts are also itemized. It gives us more information than the public knew about these illicit contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians, whether they rise to the level of a criminal conspiracy or not. And contrary to what the Attorney General represented, the special counsel makes it clear he did not consider collusion, as that colloquial term is understood, but rather whether the facts amounted to the crime of conspiracy. And on that issue, in fact, in the case of the Trump Tower meeting, he found that while there was evidence, he could not establish two parts of the crime. That, in fact, Don Jr. did accept the offer of Russian help, but that he could not establish with admissible evidence either the willful intent by Kushner or Don Jr. or Manafort to violate the law, or that the material they received was sufficiently damaging to meet the statutory definition. That is a far cry from saying there is no evidence. That is the special counsel's determination that, notwithstanding the evidence on this issue involving Trump Tower and other interactions, like the provision of polling data by Manafort, which we have learned today was far more ongoing than we knew, that the special counsel could not establish a criminal conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt and to the satisfaction of a jury. So these are the overall conclusions. But let me just say, to sum up, and then I'll be happy to go to your questions. As I said some time ago, whether these acts are criminal or not, whether the obstruction of justice was criminal or not, or whether these contacts were sufficiently illicit or not to rise to the level of a criminal conspiracy, they are unquestionably dishonest, unethical, immoral, and unpatriotic, and should be condemned by every American. That is not the subject of vindication. That is the subject of condemnation. And that is how I think we should view the Mueller report. And I'm happy to go to your questions.
Did the Mueller report adequately address all your questions regarding conspiracy or collusion, or do you have additional questions you hope will be answered by your committee?
There are sections certainly that are redacted in the report, some that clearly go to facts that are not being presented to the public, that would shed light on additional either illicit contacts or the nature of those contacts between the Russians and the Trump campaign. But other sections that are almost completely redacted go to the prosecutorial judgment. And that is when the special counsel looked at the evidence of conspiracy on these particular incidents, and in particular vis-a-vis WikiLeaks and the disclosure of that information, the contacts between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks, the sections on the exercise of that prosecutorial judgment, why the special counsel concluded what the counsel did, have been largely redacted. And we need to know that information. So we will be seeking the complete and unredacted report, again, so that we can do our proper oversight. One other matter that is very important to point out, and that is that, as the special counsel makes clear in the report, the counterintelligence findings are not completely included in this report. That, in fact, there were FBI agents embedded in the special counsel's team who were looking at the issue of compromise or counterintelligence, and that some of that information is not included. Others, of course, it may be included but redacted. Our committee, the Intelligence Committee, has requested that Mueller come and testify. We want to understand exactly what was found in terms of any counterintelligence efforts, any efforts by the Russians to make use of U.S. persons, particularly those affiliated with the Trump campaign, as witting or unwitting agents of the Russian government.
Chairman, the president tweeted out "game over." Is it game over? And has your opinion about articles changed at all as a result of what you read today?
Well, it's certainly not game over in the sense that there's a lot more that we need to know that's redacted in this report. And again, this report only goes to what is criminal or not criminal. Other actions that may have compromised the president or others around him may or may not be even included in the report. In the interest of making sure that our policy is driven by the best interests of the country and not by the personal or financial interests of the president or anyone around him, we need to find out the answers to that. But we will certainly be guided by the good investigative work that the special counsel has done. It is not our intention to redo all the painstaking work that the special counsel has conducted. Indeed, it wouldn't be possible for us to do so. The special counsel had at his access a bevy of FBI agents, subpoenas, grand juries, etc., that we do not have advantage of. This is one of the reasons why it's so important for the Congress to be able to obtain this information so we do not have to recreate the wheel. But it is important to note that the facts that are now established by this report are damning. Whether they could or should have resulted in the indictment of the president or people around him, they are damning. And we should call for better from our elected officials. The standard cannot simply be that you can do anything you like as long as you can declare at the end of the day, I am not a crook. That is not the ethical standard the American people expect in their president.
So that's Adam Schiff there, who is the House Intelligence Committee chair, saying that there was damning information in Robert Mueller's report. He is very significant to all of this. He's gone after Trump pretty enthusiastically in that role as the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. In fact, Kellyanne Conway, special counsel to the president, called for him to resign immediately after the Attorney General gave his summary of Mueller's report a month ago, when, of course, they said it was total exoneration, and the likes of Adam Schiff should sort of hang their heads in shame because everything they've been pushing for throughout these investigations has been brought to nothing. So this is Adam Schiff's moment to say, hang on a minute, that's not true. There's a lot in this report and things don't end here. He was asked about that tweet that we spoke about a minute ago, Donald Trump saying game over. He says very much that it's not. He picked up on specific things, saying that William Barr, the Attorney General, had been misleading, saying that the president had fully cooperated, when what we learned from the report was that Robert Mueller had said that the written statements that President Trump gave, because they knew if they actually subpoenaed him to come and be questioned, it would take too long, were inadequate. And also this idea that you can't indict a sitting president isn't something that Robert Mueller was going along with. So lots for them to pick over, and no doubt they will. Their aim is to get Robert Mueller on Capitol Hill to testify, and that will be another blockbuster day in this ongoing saga.
It's all fascinating, isn't it? Amanda, thank you very much.
Good evening. It's the investigation that has dominated American politics for almost 2 years. Today, the full report into alleged Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election has finally been released. The investigation was carried out by a former FBI director, Special Counsel Robert Mueller. His 2 questions: did President Trump collude with the Russian government? And did the president try to obstruct subsequent investigations into the affair? On conspiring with Russia, the answer was no. President Trump was cleared of that. But on the question of obstruction, the report did not reach a conclusion. Our North America editor, John Sopel, is in Washington for us now. John.
Well, these are the 400 pages of the report, and they're genuinely a page-turner, detailing, as it does, how Donald Trump tried to have Robert Mueller fired so that there would never be this report seeing the light of day. But will it change anyone's minds? I think those who think that Donald Trump is unfit to be president will be kind of reaffirmed in that particular view, having read the report. And those who think that Donald Trump is doing a good job and that this was a hoax and a witch hunt will take solace from the fact that the Attorney General says no laws were broken. My report, I should warn you, contains very strong language. A watershed moment for this president, and maybe the presidency itself. Donald Trump was at the White House meeting wounded warriors today, but from his 2-year-long battle with Robert Mueller, he feels he's emerged unscathed, his reputation intact. He said his guests were having a good time.
I'm having a good day too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction.
Before publication of this long-awaited report, the president tweeted this, with its Game of Thrones styling. And his team, confident, putting out this video.
No collusion. There was no collusion. No collusion.
The 400-page report is riveting and dramatic. It describes the fallout from the firing of the FBI director, James Comey. The then Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, goes in to see the president to tell him that he's decided to appoint a special counsel to investigate Russian collusion and obstruction of justice. Donald Trump is furious and uses very strong language. According to the Mueller report, the president slumped back in his chair and said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm fucked. This is the worst thing that ever happened to me." The report conveys a picture of a White House in total meltdown, with the president angrily demanding that Robert Mueller be fired. Don McGahn, who was then the general counsel, is repeatedly told to arrange for Mueller to be sacked. McGahn refuses. Of the president's attempts at influence, the Mueller report says they were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out orders or accede to his requests. The new Attorney General has weighed in sympathetically, almost saying the president's behaviour was justified.
As the special counsel's report acknowledges, there is substantial evidence to show that the president was frustrated and angered by his sincere belief that the investigation was undermining his presidency, propelled by his political opponents, and fueled by illegal leaks.
On the other question of whether there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, a clean bill of health. The Mueller report is being devoured on Capitol Hill, debated online. Democrats aren't buying the line that the president did nothing wrong.
Even in its incomplete form, however, the Mueller report, incomplete because part of it is redacted, even in its incomplete form, however, the Mueller report outlines disturbing evidence that President Trump engaged in obstruction of justice and other misconduct.
Donald Trump has left Washington to travel to Florida for the Easter weekend. His aides say he's jacked, happy, pumped up. His Good Thursday before Good Friday. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, we'll get more from the White House in a moment, but first let's speak to our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg. And the report was very clear that there had been Russian involvement in the elections. What response has there been from Moscow?
Well, tonight, a stern-faced announcer on Russian TV tried to dismiss 400 pages of Robert Mueller with one sentence. She said, 2 years and tens of millions of dollars wasted. That's how she summed up the Mueller report. I wasn't surprised because for 2 years, Russian officials have battered away every accusation, every piece of evidence that Moscow meddled in the 2016 US election. And we heard Vladimir Putin's spokesman doing the same today. Of the Mueller report, he said, this is not an object of interest for us. We will flick through it and see if there's anything worthy of analysis. So pretty dismissive, but pretty damning was the conclusion of Robert Mueller about Russia's sweeping interference in the US election. You know, Russia had high hopes for Donald Trump, and in 2016, many here hoped that he would transform US-Russian relations, and many still hope he can. But that, I think, is wishful thinking, because the contents of the Mueller report will affect US-Russian relations for a long time to come.
And John, Donald Trump's legal team is calling this report a total victory. Is it?
Well, in their mind, yes, it is, because there's no collusion. That's clear from the report. And the Attorney General says there is no need to prosecute over obstruction of justice. But Democrats will say there are still many, many more questions that need to be answered. They will be subpoenaing people, calling for papers and documents to be submitted to them as part of their investigation. They'll also want to talk to Robert Mueller, and he faces some tough questions. He said the written answers he got from Donald Trump were inadequate. Well, if that was the case, why didn't Mr. Mueller subpoena the president to come and give evidence directly? So they'll want to know about that as well. Now, Mueller points out in the report 10 occasions where he says there could have been obstruction of justice by the president, and details each one individually. But just imagine for a minute, Sophie, that the Donald Trump staff had obeyed the orders that he barked out to them, that they should fire Robert Mueller. It's arguable that the actions of Donald Trump's aides have saved Donald Trump from himself, because if they'd carried out his orders, there may well be a genuine case for obstruction of justice.
John Sopel in Washington, Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. Thank you both.
Now, the devil is in the detail, or so the saying goes, and several weeks after the Mueller report into Russian meddling into the US presidential election of 2016 was delivered, today it was released to the public. Till now, all we had to go on was a 4-page summary of it by President Trump's Attorney General, saying his boss was effectively exonerated. But if President Trump's opponents were hoping to find a damaging smoking gun that he obstructed justice and got into the White House with Russian help, well, they were disappointed. What was interesting, in the words that weren't blacked out, was the president's reaction to being told the inquiry was being held. He swore badly, and there were other bad language in the findings.
The President of the United States. As Donald Trump lavished praise on injured soldiers at the White House this morning, Americans wondered what wounds, if any, had been inflicted on him by the exhaustive Mueller inquiry. Speaking an hour before the report was even made public, the president announced his own conclusion.
No collusion, no obstruction. It should never happen to another president again. This hoax, it should never happen to another president again.
The report has been delivered.
The publication of the report was not the climactic moment the president's opponents had wished for. They'd pinned their hopes on the special counsel who led the inquiry. Robert Mueller has a reputation as a straight-shooting lawman, and Donald Trump was intimidated by him. The report says that when told of Mueller's appointment, the president responded by saying, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm finished," or a word to that effect. But instead of conclusions that are black and white, Mueller has come up with shades of grey. It's the president himself who seized on the chance to provide clarity, mimicking the Game of Thrones denouement. He pronounced on Twitter it was a case of game over.
Do you think this is a win for Donald Trump?
It's certainly a public relations win, and it's a win in that he no longer has criminal liability.
In truth, Mueller identified 10 instances of potential obstruction of justice by Donald Trump, but he made no recommendations either way regarding prosecutions. Instead, the Trump-appointed Attorney General has concluded that whatever the president did, it was not criminal.
The evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense.
Any reaction to the Mueller report?
A short time ago, President Trump left Washington to fly to Florida for Easter.
Sir, why did you think Robert Mueller's appointment would end your presidency, sir?
He's secure in the knowledge that in the end, Mueller didn't finish him. He was given the benefit of the doubt, for the time being at least.
And John is in Washington. John, today was the day that Washington was waiting for, but it's not over, so what happens now?
Well, as you saw there, Raggy, Donald Trump hopes this is game over. And I don't think it's any coincidence that his Attorney General went public with this report on the eve of a 4-day Easter holiday. The White House will be hoping that by the time Americans re-engage next Tuesday, the news cycle will have moved on. But that's unlikely, mainly because Congress will step in now. They want to question the special counsel, Robert Mueller, and if he's subpoenaed, he will have to appear on Capitol Hill, where Democratic congressmen and women will ask him why he gave the president the benefit of the doubt on 10 separate instances of potential obstruction of justice. They'll also ask him, what were the president's intentions? Might he be guilty of conspiring to obstruct justice? And there's a paragraph in the report that lends itself to that. I'll quote it. It says, the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out orders or accede to his requests, which suggests to me, had his subordinates done as he told them, he would be guilty of obstruction. Game over, Raggy? Probably not just yet.
Very intriguing. Johnny, thank you very much indeed. John Irvine in Washington.